So I do think, in terms of like Latin Christianity, certainly in terms of the Roman Catholic Church, and then also in terms of this carried over into Protestantism, the more accurate representation of the view would be to say that, well, we do believe in ghosts, if you mean disembodied human souls. We just don't think they're here, right? We think they leave the body and they go off someplace else called heaven or hell or purgatory, right? Something like that. Purgatory, obviously, if you're Catholic, that's a non-option. If you're a Protestant, so you've just got, heaven and hell. I will say that speaking as an Eastern Orthodox Christian, my own view, as I started investigating this sort of thing, is that I became much more open to the idea that there are such things as ghosts here among us. And here's why. One of the things that, first of all, I had noticed was that the Eastern Church Fathers very frequently would speak about, things like Hades, right, the realm of the dead, or Gehenna, or paradise, in ways that indicated that these were more conditions of the soul than locations, that the locations were in some ways indications of a spiritual state. And so they were in some sense allegorical. This is the sort of thing that I noticed originally, actually, before I was Eastern Orthodox, when I was studying certain things having to do with different ancient views of death and resurrection or immortality or whatever it may be. And I noticed that in looking at Alexandrian Judaism, for example, as well as even looking at certain people like Josephus, I noticed this contrast. On the one hand, yes, you did have certain Jewish traditions recorded, like in Josephus's dissertation on Hades, I think it's called. Josephus's piece on that, he ends up recording sort of the standard, very literal picture of Hades, right? The concept of Hades there. And so he talks about Hades being the sort of subterranean region that the souls of the dead are carried off to. He talked about, the righteous being sort of put over here and the wicked being put over there. And they're sort of ushered there by angels who keep them in check, sort of offering comfort to the righteous and, sort of keeping in check through discipline, or punishments, the wicked. He also then talked about Gehenna, this lake of fire that nobody's in yet because people are cast in there, after the final judgment. So hell, right, in this, sort of very literal Jewish concept, nobody's in hell, right, because that comes after the final judgment. And so he offered this very sort of literal picture. But then what I was interested in is when you looked at Alexandrian Judaism, you started to see people like Philo of Alexandria who spoke in more allegorical terms about the afterlife and these sorts of pictures in ways where they had more to do with spiritual realities. So, for example, Philo of Alexandria kind of mocks that picture of Hades. He says explicitly, like, there's no subterranean region beneath your feet. If you want to know what the realm of the dead is, what the real Hades is, it has to do with the soul bound by the passions, wandering in darkness apart from God, right? So for somebody like Philo, Hades is indicative, the realm of the dead, right? That sort of thing is indicative of a certain spiritual condition of being dead, of being bound by the passions, of wandering in vice, wandering in spiritual darkness and barrenness apart from God. That's what Philo understands. And what I noticed is that this sort of this sort of Jewish contrast that you would see there between these very literal readings and then these sort of more allegorical readings extended in many ways to Latin and Eastern Christianity, that many of the Eastern fathers had a tendency to, like the other Alexandrian Jews, read some of the spiritual realities in the same allegorical way. And that's no surprise, right? The Alexandrian school of thought was highly influential in the Christian East. People like Origen of Alexandria or Athanasius of Alexandria, right? You had these people who came out of that Alexandrian school who very much approached theology in much the same way. And so when you look at that, you see several different themes that come up again and again that are rather interesting, emerging out of this Eastern patristic school of thought. And I'll name just a couple of them. One, it's interesting if you look at the Alexandrian Jews oftentimes thought, and then this carried over into the Christians, they oftentimes thought that there are intentionally sort of tensions that happen within biblical texts that are meant to awakened you to the fact that the text should not be read strictly literally, right? So there was a certain method that is approaching this that they think it's intentional that you go, that's weird. And then that dissonance forces you to think in ways that go beyond the literal meaning, right? That the structure there is meant to clue you in, right? That this shouldn't be taken literally. And so there are a couple of interesting examples of this. Like, so for example, Christ, when he's speaking with a thief on the cross, actually says, today you'll be with me in paradise. And yet in the gospel accounts, after he's raised from the dead, he says, I haven't yet ascended to see my Father. So that raises this question, well, what on earth happened, right? How is it that he hasn't ascended to see his Father, and yet the thief is with him today, right? Today he's with him in paradise. And the way you see Chrysostom, for example, John Chrysostom reads this, I believe it's in his homily, like the cross in the graveyard. He talks about this, he talks about the fact that Christ himself is paradise, right? To be with Christ is to be in paradise. And so Christ descending into Hades, entering the realm of the dead, which he would do just by virtue of leaving his body, right? He goes where dead people go. By entering the realm of the dead, transformed the realm of the dead into paradise. And this was a consistent theme, incidentally. If you're unfamiliar with this in the Eastern Church Fathers, they oftentimes thought that, what the incarnation does is that the Son of God, who has life and immortality and incorruption in himself and holiness, he enters into these things that are dying and brings life to them. He enters into things that are unholy and he makes them holy, right? He sanctifies them. His entrance into them is meant to transform them. This is, for example, the background of holy water, where the idea is that the baptism of Christ is where waters are typically meant to wash us and make us clean. In this sense, Christ, by descending into them, actually defeats, the demonic powers that were oftentimes associated with the demonic, with the chaotic waters, crushing the head of Leviathan and communicating holiness, right, to the waters. And so every year, the baptism of Christ, a theophany, referring to the revelation of the Trinity there, because the Son of God is descending and the Spirit is, or the Son of God is being baptized, the Spirit is descending, the Father is speaking from heaven. That's why it's called theophany, right? This revelation of the Holy Trinity is commemorated, and a priest goes and he throws a cross into the water, and that, the throwing of that cross into that water is supposed to do the same thing, right? You're reenacting this crushing of the head of Leviathan, right? This demonic figure, and the purifying of the waters and making them holy. And that's how you make the holy water for, the entire year. And so you see this sort of thing happen, and it happened a lot within the Eastern Church Fathers, and it is with the realm of the dead. You could go to my Substack and read a 2-part thing that I did on Christ's descent into Hades. Anyway, I talk about the Eastern and the Western views of that. And I talk about, the fact that in the Eastern Fathers, Christ entering into the realm of the dead is meant to dispel the darkness, bring life to the dead, burst Hades, right? The realm of the dead, right? The one who holds men captive, and bring life to the dead, and, leave no one left in the grave. And so that's a big part of what goes on in the doctrine of Christ's entrance or descent into Hades. And so here what you see with the thief, for example, is him being told that he'll be in paradise, even though where he's going is the realm of the dead. It has to do with the fact that paradise is Christ, right? Being in the presence of Christ. You see this also in the Eastern Fathers and how they read, for example, Eden. So the Garden of Eden, the word means paradise. And somebody like Basil of Caesarea talks about the fact that Adam was in paradise, right? Meaning that he beheld the divine glory, right? He could, the eyes of his soul were open and he could see God, right? He could see the divine energies, the glory of God. And so what Basil also says in one of his homilies is he says that Adam was immediately out of paradise when he sinned. Why? Well, his feet were in the same place. It's because the true paradise of Eden didn't have to do with trees, it didn't have to do with plants. Any place that Adam went was paradise. Why? Because he was in communion with God. And so when that communion was broken and, the soul was wounded and all of that, he was immediately out of paradise. So you see the same sort of thing there, right? For Adam, He is in paradise because he beholds the divine glory, and then he's out of paradise the moment he breaks communion with that. With a thief, even though he doesn't ascend to see God, right, in heaven, he ends up, he enters the realm of the dead, but because he's there with Christ, Christ is that paradise, right? He transforms Hades into paradise. So you also see the same thing happen with the Cappadocians, who will oftentimes focus on the fact that Christ says the kingdom of God is within you. And this they understood to again be the fact that the soul that is in communion with God is never alone, right? One who has God within him is never alone, or that the people would go out into the desert and they would transform a desert into paradise. Why? Because, they're in communion with God. So you'd see these sorts of things happen, these sorts of themes happen within the Eastern Fathers. But you'd also even see it with regard to Hades, as I had mentioned. So one of the things, for example, that Gregory of Nyssa talks about, when he talks about the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, which is a fascinating parable, you see, the rich man and Lazarus are both, they're carried off to Hades in this parable. And there are a number of things that are interesting about it. But one of the things that is interesting that Gregory notes is that they talk about this great gulf between them such that no man can cross. And yet, the rich man presumes that Lazarus could, dip his finger in water and put it on his tongue. They're in proximity to talk to each other and so on. And so Gregory of Nyssa interprets this great gulf, right, this great gap between them that no man can cross, as the infinite gulf between, the righteous and the wicked, between virtue and vice, between, the torment of virtue and, comfort and things like that. That the comfort that, Lazarus is receiving at Abraham's bosom. So this is one of the things that happens again and again in the Eastern Fathers. And in keeping with that, when some of them get pressed on the literal question of, well, where are they, right? Where is Hades? Where is Gehenna? Where is, paradise? There tends to be this, this disposition to say that that's almost a matter of indifference. You can see this, for example, in the dialogue, Gregory of Nyssa's dialogue with Macrina. And so in the dialogue, this is an interesting dialogue if you're unfamiliar with this. Basil of Caesarea, who is Gregory of Nyssa's brother, had died. And Gregory is sort of despairing. And he's starting to doubt. He's like, maybe Basil is gone, and maybe the hope of the afterlife is in vain, and all this sort of stuff. And Macrina, his sister, who both Basil and Gregory identify as like the true philosopher, they both revere her. Basil of Caesarea, incidentally, she studied philosophy in Athens, and I think Gregory actually is like, he was a little full of himself when he got back. But Macrina put him in his place, right? Like, so Macrina is this, they're like, she's the real Socrates. Anyway, so on the soul and the resurrection, what happens is she's like, okay, you're worried that like Basil's gone. Okay, let's do this. You go ahead and you give me everything you've got in terms of your pessimistic, cynical, skeptical case, and I'll play your dialogue partner, and we'll see what truth emerges, what side truth is on. And so that's what this dialogue about the soul and the resurrection is. And it's interesting because at one point in there, Macrina actually identifies, she makes this point that says, well, she does a reductio ad absurdum with the idea that Hades is under the earth, right? Is the subterranean region under the earth. And her argument is interesting because she first of all identifies the fact that souls are, aerial spirits, that the dwelling of the place is of souls or of spirits, is the air. And this is actually pretty standard, right? You and I are terrestrial entities, meaning we have bodies that are, glued to the earth, right, so to speak. Whereas spirits do not, right? They do not have fleshly bodies, and so they float in the air, and they literally meant, the air around us. And so when spirits are referred to, or angels are referred to as aerial spirits, right? Or demons are referred to as aerial spirits, like in hymnody or things like that. That's what they're talking about. They dwell in the air. And so Macrina ends up pointing out that, well, if Basil's soul has left his body, or if, then then, the dwelling of spirits is the air. And she says, and the earth is a sphere. So if anybody tells you, by the way, like everybody thought the world was flat, that's actually not true demonstrably. There are multiple ancient texts, this being one of them, that shows that that's not actually true, that was ubiquitous, that the earth is flat. So she's like, so the earth is a sphere, and the air above the earth and the air below the earth is the same air. So what would it mean, right? It becomes a matter of indifference. Just say whether it's, up here, down here, it actually becomes in some ways almost meaningless. And so Macrina, she actually offers a reductio where she doesn't believe that Hades is a subterranean region sitting in the belly of the sphere or something like that. And so all that's to say is that even though the church fathers and scripture and hymnody will oftentimes use these pictures having to do with, paradise or Hades or Gehenna, that these pictures are all understood to be, well, exactly that, pictures. I mean, just take, for example, Hades in the Eastern tradition. So I've mentioned numerous times here that Hades is thought of as a subterranean region, like this cave within the belly of the earth. And that's true, that's one of the traditions. But one of the things you also see is that Hades is also thought of as a monster, right? A being who swallows men. Right. And so you actually see this in a number of other places. First of all, you can arguably see it in the book of Revelation. You see this imagery where Hades gives up its dead. And the verb there, leads me to believe that it's actually using the anthropomorphic view of Hades, right? It's vomiting up the dead. Chrysostom's homily, his famous Paschal homily, Easter homily, where he talks about Christ liberating all from the dead. He actually talks about Hades being vexed, and he highly anthropomorphizes Hades. You also see in the Gospel of Nicodemus, which is this early Christian text, it's not considered scripture, but it's an early Christian text, there's a fantastic dialogue. I love this dialogue. I've wanted to work this into a movie. There's a fantastic dialogue between the devil and Hades. And the devil goes to Hades, and he's trying to get him to prepare himself to receive this man, Jesus. And Hades wants to know, like, why are you so interested in this particular guy? And the devil's like, he's a man who fears death like any other. And Hades is like, is he the one who has robbed me of men? Referring to people like Lazarus. And the devil's like, it's that same Jesus. And Hades says, it's a wonderful line. He says, I implore you, by my might and by yours, do not bring this man to me. And the picture is that this is, the early Christian narrative that Hades, by swallowing up Christ, ends up being burst and overturned, right? The idea being that Hades in some way a body of death, right? This is the anthropomorphism of death that takes men into itself and administers death to them. But if he swallows in one who is life itself, the opposite happens, right? A good infection, as Lewis puts it, where life spreads and overturns Hades, and it ends up releasing, all of the dead. And so you have that sort of picture. Now, the reason I bring up that sort of anthropomorphism of Hades as contrasted with the cave concept of Hades is to say that within these early Christian, images, and you see that, by the way, you see that anthropomorphized Hades if you look at the Last Judgment. There's what's sometimes, unfortunately, called the hell mouth. I say unfortunately because hell and Hades, Gehenna and hadēs are two different things in Jewish and then Christian tradition. But you see in the lower corner, right, this monster's head, right, that's vomiting up the dead, giving up the dead for judgment. And then you see that same thing in the Jonah icon, where you have the same head is vomiting up Jonah, who looks like Jesus. And that's because, Christ uses Jonah as a type, right, where he's in the belly of the whale for 3 days, just as he's in the belly of the earth that is in Hades for 3 days before, coming forth. So anyway, all that's to say is that when you look at the Eastern Fathers, what you start to see with them is you see that none of these images about hell and Hades and paradise are taken so literally, having to do with locations, as if you are sort of ushered into the doors of heaven or something like that, or ushered into the chamber of hell, or something like that. Instead, what you see with them time and again is you see that these are meant to be pictures that convey certain spiritual realities of being in a state of darkness or of death or dying. Paradise being a state of being healed and being restored and being in communion with God, and so on. And so for that reason, what you also see with them is you see this openness to the idea, well, like, sure, maybe the spirits dwell in the air. And in this sense, what you start to see is you start to see less of a picture of, a spatio-temporal sort of like heaven is up here and hell is down here and the earth is in here or something like that. What you get is almost this more picture of a veil, right? Something like these are overlapping realities. That sort of on the other side of that veil, if we could sort of peer through it, we start to glance the spiritual realities, things like, angels and demons and the dead. And you see this come through in things like the concept about the liturgy, the idea that the saints are observing us. They are a great cloud of witness that are observing what's going on. In the liturgy itself, the divine liturgy of John Chrysostom, we welcome into the divine liturgy the saints and the angels under the presumption that they have somehow come and are present with us. And this sort of earthly worship is overlapping and mirroring this heavenly worship that's happening, and so on. And that's one of the reasons also why throughout so much of Eastern Christian tradition, you have so many stories of saints appearing, showing up, doing things. They are, God is not the God of the dead, but of the living, right? They are present. They are observers. They are proactive agents in the world. They occupy the same world that we do. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't done so already, please go ahead and follow, subscribe, hit like if that's an option on whatever you're listening to. All that sort of stuff really helps us out here. So I greatly appreciate your support. And until next time, I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.